housekeeping as always to start. I could ask all those not on the panel just to mute their mics and kill their video for us to keep the bandwidth on the call down. How you can interact with this session will be through the chat. Sid will be in the background on there, interacting with you on there, and I will try and get across that to feed questions in. Larry, I think we just saw you outside of HBP. That was a great little insight before the video went there. It's good to see somebody out in the sun. And yeah, just a reminder, we are recording these calls and they are available. Thanks for your feedback. They are more readily available and easily findable now through the British Canoeing YouTube channel and on the online section of our website, which Sid can link to at the end of the session. So athlete motivation this week. Thanks for all your attendance on the webinars. I think we're up knocking on people present and YouTube to 200 views for week 1. Sid's promised me if we get up to 500, we get our own jingle. So yeah, if you can keep connecting with that, that's superb. So athlete motivation, linking really closely to last week's session on coach-athlete relationships. Key takeaways really that I took from there, and I think they're important for us all to consider in action within our practice, was the connecting the learner to self, and that being a key role of the coach, really understanding the person in front of you, but also fostering a connection within them to themselves. Danielle talked a lot around the giving and receiving of permissions in that two-way co-creating relationship, and we also had a little focus on the research side with Jowett and how you can monitor the the quality of the relationship, the coach-athlete relationship, through the 4 C's of closeness, commitment, complementarity, and co-orientation. And I'm sure that links really nicely into today's session on athlete motivation. I'm going to cover that in general terms and specific to lockdown. We don't want to focus purely on lockdown life, because I think hopefully that's not too distant future when we can return to a normal, whatever that may be, domains. Quick intro to the panel today. Delighted to have you all here. Thank you very much. It's the Nottingham crew, certainly from a work perspective. And there is some allegiance to a football club that I despise of, Wolverhampton Wanderers, but we'll try and look beyond that today when we chat to Alex. James Train, thanks for joining us. Do you want to give a little intro to the audience, please?
Yeah, I'm James Train and the senior canoe coach with the women's group up in Nottingham. Had a few roles before that, just working through podium potential and doing some work with fast track as I was sort of coming through. So wide range, but that's where I am now with the senior women. Brilliant,
thank you, James. Neil Buckley.
Yeah, I'm Neil Buckley. I'm based in Nottingham, and I look after the EPS programme athletes in Nottingham. So for 6 athletes there that are at university and various other roles within the organisation in previous ages.
Previous incarnations.
Yes.
Brilliant. Thank you, Neil. And Alex Feary, welcome. First time on.
Thank you, Craig. Yeah, so my name's Alex. I've worked for about 3 years now as the sports psychologist for the sprint programme. I do feel like I need to apologise for the shirt, the way this call's gone so far. It's mainly down to my disorganisation and not switching my clothing in between calls today. So I might just tilt my camera up here for now, Craig.
Beautiful, yeah, that's certainly me. I think you're in a bit of luck in that my experience of canoeists in general is their allegiance to football isn't super strong. There are a few on the call today I know who will have an opinion on that shirt. Brilliant. We're going to start with you, Alex. Let's kick off athlete motivation. I guess linked to last week, I'm just really keen to hear where athlete motivation sits within the coach-athlete relationship for you.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting question, because I'm not sure everyone would immediately associate the two. You know, how does the relationship between the coach and the athlete link or fit with an individual athlete's motivation? But for me, the clear link is, I guess, in the openness between the two. So, you know, for me, the stronger the relationship between coach and athlete, the higher level of openness you're likely to get. And so that two-way feedback process that Danielle sounds like she's talked about last week is going to be stronger, and you get more information. And then from that information and the understanding, you're probably going to learn more about what drives the athlete, what sort of things are really going to float the boat, but also what probably their challenges are and the pressures, which are equally as important to understand. because if you can get a sense of that, you might start to figure out, well, what's going to undermine or take away from some of the athlete motivation. So yeah, I think, yeah.
Awesome. I know certainly when I was sort of in my earlier coaching years, it seemed to be this dichotomy of like performance focus and mastery focus. Is it as simple as that when we're looking at athlete motivation?
Yeah, it's a good question. So just to clarify this, it's been a while since I've looked at the academic literature around this, but I think the mastery focus is more around an athlete having goals for their own progression and development, and the performance focus is about comparing themselves to others and competing against others. Is that your understanding as well, Greg?
Yes, it certainly is. Yeah, I guess it's that that persistence and drive to master skill and your own development versus perhaps being what people might more traditionally be called outcome focused, I guess. Yeah, that's my understanding.
Yeah, so the last bit of research I remember hearing around this was that elite level athletes tend to be high on both. So they typically have a high drive to compare well and compete against others, but they're also able to really focus on their own performance. And for me, I think I'm going to take this stance a lot, I imagine, but it's going to be individual. I know for me as an individual, I don't actually do so well when I start comparing myself to others. That's probably where I get that little short-term spike of energy and adrenaline. But actually, I know to get the best out of me, I want to focus on what I want to do and what my progression route is. So I'd imagine that each athlete might have a slightly different strength around where they focus and what gets the best out of them.
In your position as a psychologist, Alex, across multiple sports, would you say you've seen any individuals evolve from maybe they start out with pure performance or pure outcome focus? Have you seen an evolution towards the mastery or vice versa over time?
I think I've seen a level of awareness shift. So people become more aware of maybe where their preference is and a little bit then better at using that awareness. So they can notice when actually I'm overdoing the performance focus. Am I overdoing the comparisons, and is it actually hindering me at the moment? And starting to shift away from it when needed. I think the danger happens with athletes, and the sort of the impact it has on them is when maybe they're unsure or unclear on when that's going on for them, and so they just get dragged down a rabbit hole, and it's not very helpful. And actually bringing that to their awareness can be a really nice starting point.
Brilliant. Final one for you, Alex, before we delve into some contextual examples from the panel. I guess what sort of things impact upon athlete motivation?
So, yeah, it's a big one. I think I'd start by saying, motivation is not a thing, is it? It's a word. So in my head, I suppose what I think of when I think of athlete motivation, it's any behaviours that will help an athlete develop over time. So, for example, they turn up engaged, ready to go on a session, versus coming kind of flat or with low energy and finding it difficult to focus. Or perhaps the athlete who can stick consistently to a training plan rather than kind of turning up for some bits of the training session and dropping off for other parts. And I think a lot will influence that from lifestyle factors to what they're being asked to do. But for me, the important thing is, as a coach and as a staff team, we hold in mind motivation doesn't sit within an individual only. It's influenced by a number of things. So yes, the individual will be a big part of it, but also the tasks of what they're being asked to do is going to play a role. There's some things that people ask me to do and I'll seem really motivated, and there's other things they ask me to do and I definitely won't look like a motivated person. And then also the third part of that I think that's really important is the environment. And what I mean by that is the relationships people have with those around them while they're doing these training sessions. So what the relationship's like with the coach is going to factor, but also what's the relationship like with their teammates or those teammates who are also the competitors in some spaces, which is a funny dynamic. And I think all of that, the individual, the task and the environment are going to have a huge influence on some of those behaviours.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Quoting a bit of the constraints-led approach there with the task, environment and relationships. I guess, yeah, we're hearing a very strong message there, a really clear one that motivation doesn't just sit with the individual. And I think we could all empathise with that in terms of our lives, be it in professional or personal settings, in terms of what we are more motivated to do or what experiences we have. Going to head over to James Train. James, I guess having heard Alex talk there and from your experience, how do we as coaches and practitioners influence athlete motivation? What is it that you've found works?
Yeah, so from my point of view, in terms of influencing it, I think one, and relates to what Alex said, one is just how do we really effectively goal set? And I think for me that's where it all starts. If we really understand the goal setting process and we've taken the athlete on a really great goal setting journey, then we're going to start to understand their wider purpose and why they're there. So I think that speaks to what Alex was talking around of really understanding the deeper motivations of athletes and what they're trying to do. So I think that's one for me for sure. I think within that, I think Alex also really mentioned something that I really believe in that you really have to talk about it, and you have to build that relationship where the athlete can trust you and probably really open up about what those motivations are, so you can really engage with that. And I think just on another part of it, and I don't know whether we want to take it this way, but there's a conversation myself and Alex were having is where we can influence is sometimes where athletes are too motivated in one direction, and that might be towards performance, but it could also be towards process. And we can probably work with them to give them the nudges so they create the right balance in that. So I suppose there'd be three key things for me. Cool. I think I'll put you on mute, Craig.
My apologies, still learning. Keen to dive into the last one there, James. I think that's fascinating. When you are coming across an athlete who is too motivated, what sort of things might you and Alex draw upon to tackle that?
Yes, I suppose just if we're going to take it out. So in terms of too motivated, I think.
What's the consequence of being too motivated?
Yes, I think that's a nice question. So I think in terms of the consequences can be, I think if somebody's very performance orientated, they're really struggling to just even create the headspace and even engage with some of those learning environments you might be trying to create, because they're very focused on outcomes and comparisons to others. So I think you're just never then creating a learning environment that's going to really, really move them on. I think a consequence of the performance-focused or overly performance-focused athlete is really in our sport risk of injury and just risk of just really using the hammer as the only tool, and sometimes using the hammer on themselves. And then probably the other side of which I have seen as well is that person that's very process orientated. You probably love them as a coach to start with, but I think it's really about then teasing out what motivates them to perform, and just an acceptance of that is a reality of at least our environment, is that performance is part of it. And I think it's finding what's their version of performance which is motivating. I think is probably the journey we've been on. So that would be. We've got a bit of an echo there. That would be probably the two different ends of it for me.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Going to head over to Neil. Like, I'm really interested. Just threading on from that, I think we've all had experiences of maybe that need for separation of self from athlete, and when people begin to connect with that they are James trained first of all who canoes, and not James trained the canoeist, I think is a really interesting angle on athlete motivation, how people manage that sort of balance of performance and process. Neil, coming to you first for a quick fire round. Examples of your best work and also examples of your best mistakes in the area of athlete motivation.
Quick fire, Craig.
Quick fire.
Worst is literally just telling an athlete what to do at a session, never met them before. Right, this is what we're doing, off we go. And that has worked, but it's also backfired quite a lot. Best is completely the opposite, really, is really getting to know the athlete before you start, knowing the person and what really, finding their inner needs and inner motivation to allow them to perform at their best or paddle at their best, if it's winning or if it's process, if it's whatever they want, really. And then, yeah.
Brilliant. I want to celebrate your learning from mistakes there a little bit more, Neil. In the experiences where maybe that, like, I think I what I'm suggesting from that is that maybe it can have a short-term impact to get a result or an outcome if you take that more direct command approach. I guess how is it you knew it wasn't right over time, and what did you do to try and move towards that sort of more relational approach?
I guess the first instance is you get a backlash off the athlete or the person straight away, and the session is gone. And that was at an international race, so that was a big learning for me, really. Also, it could be a little bit a year later down the line is when you're not able to be there to help them at a race, and their thought processes just aren't there, and they're too reliant on you. And I think that's one that takes the longer time to work out. That could take 6 months, a year, maybe more. And when you're not in the picture, I was unfortunate last year not to be able to attend selection, and the athletes didn't perform to where they'd been training day to day at that venue. So that was quite upsetting for me, that maybe the work that we'd done wasn't fully sitting in their heads.
Brilliant, thank you, Neil. Nick, same question. I guess best example of work in this space that's had a positive impact, and also best mistake.
Hi, Craig. I think the best example from my point of view is being able to set clear targets for athletes and achievable, and they've still got the relevant level of challenge. So there was a young junior lad working up in Nottingham, and he was struggling for a bit of confidence, and so we broke it right down into, okay, what's required at this particular level to define success. And so making those challenging steps build into a performance at selection that got him into a K4 was really quite simplistic in its approach, but quite a challenge because of the sort of insecure nature around, or the fragile state of mind around that particular athlete at the time. And it took a lot of building on those successes to drive the motivation onto the next one. And when success wasn't, and I use success in inverted commas, when success wasn't there, the motivation became sort of null and void. So there's a big rebuilding project almost every time came out of any sort of assessment, time trial piece of work out the back of that. So that's where the biggest success was, keeping it simple, really. Brilliant,
thanks, Nick. And a celebration of mistakes. Even you aren't perfect, I'm sure, sir.
Yeah, I nearly went and got my Sheffield Wednesday shirt on just to make Alex feel a bit easier. I think we had a very talented K4 a couple of years ago, and the balancing act of trying to blend the personalities and the individual motivations for these guys was, they were just on different places in terms of motivation. So one of them wanted to take on the whole world. Some people were happy to be there. One guy was last year under 23. So, there was not addressing those early enough in the season meant that we didn't achieve what the boat was potentially capable of come race time.
Okay, brilliant. It's fascinating. Lovely little segue there. I'm keen to jump to that with James Train a little bit. Thank you, Nick. In terms of, I know, James, you've worked hard on how you marry within crew boats, particularly in sprint, the individual motivations across a crew. Are you able to shine a bit of light on some of the experiences you've had there, James?
Yeah, so Nick's just hit it on the head, really, in terms of what was potentially he felt he missed in that situation with the K4. Of the simplest way I can put it down to is creating shared purpose, and there's a higher purpose that the boat absolutely believes in, and then I think the other key bit around that is that they trust the people they're in the boat with to go about delivering that. My experience of when that's got, I don't think we've nailed it completely, but when we've got closer to that is when we've had our most success. And I've definitely had boats where that's not been addressed, or we've not looked at that as Nick was saying, quite close, where it's it's constantly hindered us a lot along the way. So I think they're the two pieces for me.
Fantastic. And am I right in saying, James, that the understanding of that and the sharing of that sort of trust and shared purpose trickles right down into what you do around a session? I know you've done a little bit on how you reflect, or how that both sort of reviews performance.
Yeah, so in the specific example we're talking around, it's I think they got to the shared purpose bit okay, but I think the trust bit was continually just challenged a little bit by some communication. And again, myself and Alex were talking about this earlier around maybe some of the lenses that athletes put on in terms of how they see situations. And the big piece of work we did was really getting them to understand how they could meet each other halfway, and really understand that they were fighting for the same things, and they really were believing in the same things. It was potentially just some stuff in communication that was hindering the process. And I think, and I think why that relates to motivation is, I think it's very hard to be motivated and believe in something if you're not sure where the other person is when you're in a crew boat. I think that communication has to be clear.
Absolutely, and it kind of brings to mind some of the key points coming out last week with that, how we as coaches or practitioners create opportunities for communication. We give permission, we receive permission back in terms of that empowerment for co-creation, the ability for an athlete to feed in to a process and even feed back on the experience of a process from a coach's angle. I got off a call with a rugby colleague of mine recently, just today, and we just left it sort of musing, what is it that gives coaches the right to give advice to athletes about being an athlete when we don't really open the feedback loop for the same to happen to those who are receiving our coaching? So do we give athletes the opportunity to feedback on our coaching as much as we give the feedback to them on their athletic performance? And I think when we truly master the sort of openness and co-creation thing of trust and communication, and openness, as Alex said, I think we're getting into that space very nicely. Thank you to Mark Ratcliffe on the chat, and please feel free to engage on the chat and share opinions. I think Mark is more sort of reconfirming some things and giving a personal slant on there, the relationship between purpose and environment. Yeah, absolutely resonate with that and how you build that through progression. That's a great point. Thank you, Mark. Really keen, heard about crew boats. There's a lot of people on this call that work across the breadth of the pathway. Neil, keen to come to you and just have a little insight into how the role of the coach from your experience might vary in this piece across the pathway.
Thanks for that, Craig. It's a good question that I don't think I can fully answer, to be fair. From my personal perspective, I think as an overriding bit is how the athletes are led at the start to being guided towards the end of the pathway, and they become leaders and know their own personal philosophy of paddling. I think when they come in at a young age, they might not have that information. They rely on the coach to lead them down there, but it's when the athlete then starts to take control of where they want to go fully, the leader, and the coach becomes the guide, the sounding board. I think is where I sit as a coach. I don't know the full answers of how you go about that, but yeah, that's where I sit as a coach, really.
That's brilliant, and I can imagine, Neil, that is a very individual process. I think it certainly has been from my coaching experience with different people. I've got different faces in my head right now, and I won't name names, but who are much more equipped at a younger age or an earlier stage of development to do that than others. I'm putting myself in your shoes and I'm thinking, how do you cater for the individual at your level of the pathway when you're quite often working in what we might consider to be reasonable sized groups?
I think, yeah, that's something that we've worked really hard on in the last 2 years, and from a technical perspective, mental, physiologically and everything. And it's priming the sessions or priming the training blocks. So they have a really clear vision of what they want to achieve from every session. It might be a group session, but each individual athlete, say a group of 6 that I'd work with, would be really clear on their individual needs. If it's bow rudders, if it's sweep strokes, if it's the feel of the boat. I don't think it. Getting some feedback.
I'm hearing you loud and clear this end, Neil, if that helps.
Cool. Yeah, so it's really having, going back to Alex's point of winning the trust of the athlete, so they trust you in what the setup of the session is, and they can really work on their individual needs and not worried always about the stopwatch. They can go about their processes as they should. Brilliant.
Thank you, Neil. That's a good insight. I think a lot of people will empathise with that on the call in terms of that management of numbers. And we heard from Tim Scott last week on that side of how you build relationships when you've maybe got 1-2 hours a week, engaging their sort of key influencers, key stakeholders, be that parents or peers. Any questions, please fill the chat. We will take these questions around Q2, or we'll thread them in as we go, and Sid will be keeping a close eye out on those. Guess I'm keen to look at the period we're in now, really, and go to James Train first of all. What differences, James, have you had to face as a coach, or have you noticed in the athletes from what we might call the norm, if there is such a thing in our world, to the lockdown period that we're in now?
Yeah, I think I'm not sure that there is necessarily a difference for the group that I'm working with. I think I'm very lucky that I've got athletes there that their goals quite quickly got moved through to next year in terms of the moving of the Olympics, and something that was quite focused there. I know from talking with some of the talent coaches that I think there's some tougher situations potentially with a last year junior, for example, where that's suddenly probably at the end of a period of time is they're going to miss that opportunity. I think what we have done well, or I hope we've done well, is to really bring back in lockdown the qualities that we can coach that relate to the higher goal and higher purpose that we're working towards. And I think that quite quickly we've got athletes in a situation where they still feel that they're moving forwards on their goals. And I think that's been motivating for the athletes. So I think I would see that as a really key one. I think that is possible in any situation, to really just take it to a wider goal, that bigger picture, and then really understand what you can do and really positive reframe what you can do rather than potentially what you can't.
Fantastic. And James, I know you've been through a 10-day crazy period around that of late, in terms of, I guess, at the start of the lockdown. I mean, if you're happy sharing, I think it would be a lot of value in hearing how you and the paddlers you work with experience that, the context around the lockdown and what it meant for selection and the Olympic Games.
Yes, I think I've probably reflected again a little bit after we talked around it, and I think the key bit that it came down to was, so I suppose for context, the European qualifier was being changed over and over, and then it started to look like essentially that our national selection would equal an Olympic Games spot, and we were really dealing with these situations. That was probably within a sort of 72-hour period. The athletes were really having to try and come to terms with the fact that they felt that they had one journey through to a European qualification in May, and then suddenly they were potentially going to have a 10-day journey through to a national selection, which would, if it went their way, mean the sort of culmination of at least first part of their journey to becoming selected for the Games. So I think in reflecting on just the call we had the other day, Craig, that came out of that, it really threw the athletes in that I think things changed, and for that moment we had to really try and draw them back into what processes they could control. I think it very much felt like their motivation or their worries were heightened because it was a space that was constantly changing and felt very unknown. And I think that did have a big impact. Yeah, and like I said, the route forward was what processes can we control right now, which means that on that start line, you'll be in the best place you possibly can be.
Brilliant. I'm hearing you come back to what you talked about before, really, that goal setting, that shared purpose, a recalibration of that as soon as possible as a team.
Yeah.
To get some sort of direction and something, an anchor to make sense of in a bit of a violent sea, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And when I wrote some notes off back, that anchoring is a really good word. I think it's like the more you've got those processes set and something they really believe in around the both qualities, but also just what they're doing it for, I think you can always anchor back to that, and it's a relatively safe place then.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I think, once performers feel safe, we often get the best out of them in any environment. Great question from Sid. I'm gonna pass this across to Nick and Neil. On maybe start with Nick. I guess question from Sid is, how have the coaches working with younger paddlers found that they've dealt with, I guess, a sense of loss in the competitive season when goals were perhaps taken away from them? Nick?
Yeah, it's been a pretty turbulent few weeks, to be honest with you. There was the double whammy, obviously, of not just losing the season, but also for many of them losing A-levels and GCSEs. And part of the work that we've done in that talent space is helping them to facilitate the growth in both areas. So how to cope with work, schoolwork, balancing revision, how to prioritize sort of a revision period over maybe a hard training block. And then in the space of about a week, they lost both. So it has hit a few of them pretty hard. But we're very lucky in the talent space. We've got a lot of very creative coaches who've come up with a lot of ingenious ways of keeping them motivated, keeping them engaged with each other. And I think that's one of the things that's been a big success, is that we've been able to link the athletes together either virtually or through challenges, sometimes serious, sometimes silly, sometimes just purely social. So we've won the quiz nights, and I think everybody's getting pretty teetering on the edge of quizzes at the moment, I think, but there seems to be quite a few flying around. But I think James mentioned it there as well, the anchoring of really at the root of what it is that we're doing is the most important thing, and that's enjoying the canoeing, but enjoying the community aspect to it as well, and actually trying to see the bigger picture with it. So I think the last year juniors, they're in a really tough place because what's coming next with university is still unsure. But at the end of the day, bringing it back to a very basic point of view of you're still going to go canoeing one day, so it's not all doom and gloom. Let's try and reframe, repackage, and look at the future as we go ahead with some clearer goals that get them back facing in the right direction. But I actually think an interesting point from my perspective is that allowing guys to have a little bit of time to feel pretty rough. I think that's been quite healthy for a few of them as well. Especially we've got a couple of guys that we're looking at that, top 6 finishes, pushing for medals. They're not going to get that chance, and so actually allowing an 18-year-old lad to be quite down, quite angry was quite a good cathartic experience for him. And now it's about how do we rebuild that athlete into being sort of focused again and driven towards the future.
Question I have for you there, Nick. It's easy to allow an athlete to get down and be angry when you're in lockdown. Would you have done it the same way if you were seeing them every day?
I think I probably would have given them he's a bit bigger than me, so maybe not. But
brilliant. I jest. I know you're a caring individual, sir. I'm drawn to comparison there, actually, because I think James and I, in preparation for this call, had a really, if you don't mind me sharing, James, James was asked his opinion on how creative he'd been through this stage. And I think he felt he didn't really have much to give in that topic, having witnessed the likes of Nick with quizzes, with interactions, and with Imogen. And I guess I'm just really drawn to the individuality of athlete motivation at any time, but even particularly within a lockdown period. And knowing your individual, which came out clearly from last week, will determine where you go with these things, and that you don't just have to follow the latest fad, because the best things for James athletes may be to have just simple goals, simple purpose, and to get on with work. yet with a different audience or a different individual, it may be that people need to engage more socially in quizzes or shared sessions on Zoom or whatever it might be. Is that something you've found across your role, Alex, as well?
Yes, yes, mate. I think the difficulty across the sports I work in is knowing where the individual is in this lockdown phase. So you don't necessarily have a good sense of, do they need more social time? Do they need some space to process the emotion? Do they actually need some goals to be set quickly because they're at a loose end? So again, I think that two-way process, even in this time, has probably picked up for me. I'd say I've seen an increase in that. It's been brilliant, like more connections, more chat, more spaces to kind of share this. And I think that's pretty good practice.
Whilst we're with you, Alex, I've heard a lot about like environmental factors, education, as Nick touched on, is a component, psychosocial factors. I guess particularly for those youngsters, adolescents across the pathway, where does parent engagement sit in this place in terms of how coaches are trying to understand and influence athlete motivation, yet they're probably seeing them a small percentage of the time versus parents or guardians?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think could probably speak more to my experience with Wolves as I work with that sort of age group more. And actually probably the biggest learning from this season before lockdown was parent engagement and coach engagement. So for anyone who was in that, I don't know, 12, in fact, younger, probably 9 to 16, 17 age group, the coaches of those age groups and the parents could easily get into quite an avoidant cycle where they were a little bit worried what the feedback would be like or what the response to feedback would be like. So they distanced themselves, and that would build up to a point where you get some sort of a little mini explosion. The parents might come and like, what's been going on here? And actually what they've learned to do is to try to stop some of that avoidance and go towards parents and keep them engaged a bit more. And the more they've done that, the better those relationships have been and the more aligned it's been. So you've got that sort of triangle now with the player, or in this case with the athlete. So I imagine that comes across with Canoe as well. So the more you can kind of get the parent engaged and on board and have those regular touch points that's practical, the better.
I think so. I guess I've a limited experience of football, but the interaction can be a little bit more different in our environment with parents during practice. I think it's quite often, sometimes there's quite often a drop on, speaking for slalom here, and sprint, I assume as well, because you're covering greater distances in practice. It's quite hard. You're not like getting parents on the touchline, and I know a lot of football coaches don't want them on the touchline as well. But yeah, I guess how much is addressing individual parents versus addressing a group of parents that then gets cross interaction around a theme such as athlete motivation useful from your experience perhaps with football?
I think both are really useful, because often in the group settings there'll be the between parents, so they'll kind of have a sense of, actually I'm not the only one that's experiencing this, and there might be some different perspectives on how I manage it. So that can be really useful in the group setting. But then also there's been a number of times where the individual's parents or parent has come in and there's been a bit more of a specific focus around their son and the player, in that, okay, well, we're seeing these challenges, are you experiencing them as well as, at home or at school, and how can we make sense of these together and then put kind of a joint action plan in place?
Brilliant. I'm going to throw a question on that very topic. It's coming from Sid to the coaches. I'm sure we've all had these experiences. Coaches, how have you dealt with parents that may be outcome focused when the message you're trying to give is very much one of process and growth? Who's bold enough to step up to the fore in this field?
I'll have a little go, Craig, as I've just had one this year. It's a really good question, Sid, and something that I've got wrong in the past. But I think actually talking to the parents of what you want to achieve and how you're going to achieve it and why it's really important. And I think not tripping up the parent, but one parent I spoke to this year, I showed him the video of a session, and the young lad, he was doing switches and stoppers, which he'd only just started doing over 2 months. So he was paddling really well. And we left the session. It was really good. I sent it to his dad just because I wanted to keep his dad close. I asked the young lad, what did he take away from the video session with his dad? His dad said, oh, you got a kicking in that stopper. Don't do that again. I then went back to the dad and asked him what he thought his son had taken out. And he thought he'd given him so much praise. But actually what his son took out was all the negatives. And that really, and I engineered that, switched the parent to process rather than performance outcome. So
brilliant. What cracking open example, Neil. I would echo that. I think I've been coaching roughly 15 years now, and probably the biggest thing I would do different would be to engage parents much more actively than I ever did. Probably took the easy way out and tried to manage it all myself. And, you know, it's again, I wasn't the key influencer through a lot of those periods of time. So I think a really good link in this space for those who are across social media is a guy called Richard Shorter. He takes the persona of @non-perfect-dad. Be it on Insta or on Insta there, like I'm getting down with the kids there, or Twitter. I think he had a YouTube webinar indeed last night or the night before that's probably readily available. Has a book out, Conversations for the Journey Home. Talks about, I guess, from the perspective of the young person, how parent engagement can influence them, and he's done a lot of research in that field. I know there's some people like Luke Smythe down in Slalom using, we heard about that in week 1, WhatsApp groups to engage the parent around key questions that can help you learn more about your child as a performer and as someone who is looking to learn and to understand the why of their paddling, I guess, because it's quite often in my field, my experience, the why of the parents' version of their paddling that can overrule. So there's Sid. He's always got the Amazon link. He's doing a bit of marketing as well. Thanks very much, Sid. I'm gonna just transition us now, and please fire in questions because now's the time. We're getting towards the end of the content that I have in mind for this session. It's been really, really engaging. Hopefully, we're moving towards a return to normal in inverted commas. I guess, Nick, I'm going to come to you. Top tips for how you are currently planning a return to normal from a situation that has been completely abnormal and very unknown.
I mean, it's a really, really good question. We're trying, I think, best as we can to maybe stimulate a little bit of competition, whatever, again, competition looks like. Obviously, there's so much unknown in terms of social distancing and things like that that might happen, you know, carry on post the release of lockdown. But I think as far as the athletes go, we're sort of setting them up in terms of what type of athletes they want to be still capable of doing, what sort of skill sets they still need when they go back. So we're not having to completely start again. So what qualities do they maintain? What, like I say, skill sets can they improve on? And I think we've learned quite a bit in the talent space that they can still be making gains. So it might be a little bit of running, might be some strength skills with balancing, headstands, those sorts of things, that they're still making progress towards being a better athlete in general. Looking at some of the technical modeling that we've been doing recently on some of the ergo sessions, still trying to keep the key themes so that they don't, again, lose any of that work from that they've done previously through the course of the winter, and being able to look at how we set that. In terms of my next question, sorry, just to Pete Gorman there. We are talking to clubs, Pete. We had the sort of racing clubs community of practice yesterday afternoon, and we're talking there about how to make that what it takes to progress to come alive. So Scott Hines, Tim Scott, Freddie Brown, all on the call yesterday about how do we engage and sort of set things going further forwards. So that work, you know, I'm not saying that it's a gold standard, far from it, but that work is starting to happen about how to engage and work with clubs on what they're doing and how they're helping athletes to prepare for the future.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nick. And thanks, Pete, for your point. I think it is a very pressing one across all disciplines in that we're all coming out of a sense of loss of potentially the whole season, if not certain factors of it. And it really is important, as we've heard on this call, for us to calibrate around a shared purpose. So anyone who is influencing the process around an individual that we have responsibility for, then that collaboration piece is very, very important, and one we need to work together to find, because it might not be easy, given that our next competition could be, fingers crossed it won't be, but could be into 2021. James, any examples for you on how you're sort of planning ahead towards a return to outdoor practice?
Yeah, I think the key thing that we're really looking into is we almost got a bit of a dry run through a season, and up until the point that it was almost going to be the qualification events. So I'm really taking this an opportunity with the athletes I'm working with to engage them in the process, engage them in their own journey, and really get them thinking and reflecting on where we did great stuff, where we did good stuff, and then where we've got spaces where we could be even better, and really getting them to try and drive that plan forwards, really, so they feel just more and more and more that it's their plan and not mine in any way. I'm just trying to facilitate that plan for them. So I think that's probably the biggest piece in terms of being really ready for post-lockdown. I hope that I've got athletes that are even more engaged and really feel that they own their own plans and where they want to take it, and really just using the space we've had to unpick some of those things that we've been working on in really more detail than maybe we'd get if we were in a competitive season.
Brilliant. Thank you, James. I think we've heard that a lot today, and I've heard it in my world a lot, that we've probably got a few weeks left now, and it's about, what do I want to be able to say about myself that I achieved through lockdown, and that if athletes can look in the mirror and define that with shared purpose with their coaching team, they've got a few weeks left to really get after that and achieve it. Neil, any thoughts from you?
Sorry, running the question past me again, Craig.
Just how you think with your team around, you'll be approaching the return to a more normalised form of training.
So I spoke to the athletes this week, actually, and I think their motivation is even higher to get better, because they've realised what they miss. And they've missed going canoeing, and I've missed going coaching. And I think we'll get more out of every single session and appreciate the time we get in the gym, on the flat, in Lee Valley. I think the appreciation of what we've gone through will be a big driver for them. Just going back to one of the questions you asked earlier of what athletes were up to, I'm probably like James. I didn't really come up with anything too fancy and quizzes, and I sent them a few little challenges of handstands, etc., which was probably my own challenge, to be fair. But I think some of them, we allowed them to grieve for a couple of weeks and then talked about other things out of canoeing. And two of them now, one of them produced 209 PPE face masks this week, and one's been sewing PPE gowns hospital, and I just think that's absolutely phenomenal what they've done outside of canoeing, which they'd never ever have got the chance to do. So we've used it as quite just a good process to go through, really.
Brilliant. I think that's hands down won the what did I want to achieve during this period in terms of a good for society, Neil.
Well,
brilliant.
I would like to get out of it with a 5 and 7 year old running around my house, really, would be the...
Yeah, it's probably a caveat for future webinars is I'm not sure how many weeks consecutively I can enforce the exit of my children for 1 hour from the house. I think whenever we come to Alex here in terms of the psychology angle of a return or a transition of change, which is always difficult to manage. I'm mindful, Neil, when you talk with such passion, which is great, of the comment from James earlier of perhaps too much motivation to come back, and some of dangers or risks that may have around injury. I certainly think when we hop on back on Lee Valley, if we put the water on for 3 hours straight, it would be used for 3 hours straight. So we've got to be mindful of some abnormal returns. Alex, from a psychologist working with coaches, working with athletes, a change period coming up at some point, hopefully sooner than later. Any key tips in terms of the advice for that transition?
Yeah, to be honest, I think I'd echo what the coaches have all said. I think they're spot on in terms of using it as a bit of a reflection space. I think the big message would be slow down. So, you know, there's going to be, from all levels, from athletes up, from PDs down, head coaches down, there could easily be a drive to like get back into it quick and really push to kind of find form again. And I think that would run the danger of losing some of the great stuff that's come out of this period that Neil, James, and Nick have all just alluded to. So I think I would start maybe with a check-in. You know, where are we? Where are each of us in the team at? How are people finding coming out of lockdown? I would do a debrief of what we've learned. So that reflective space, I hold a bit of time for that. And then I'd do a bit of joint planning and encourage the ownership that the athletes have had more of recently to kind of guide what this might look like in the next however long period of time.
Brilliant. I've just got like a major championship race review process in my head that you just described there. You know, a period of settling, a debrief of what was achieved, what it might mean for the future, look forward to what's next, but really taking your time and also probably allowing a little bit of, I'm speaking for the people I work with, a little bit of playtime, a little bit of discovery time. I mean, they're dying just to feel that sensation of floating on water again. And I'm certainly not going to get in the way of that with too much detail as we move forward. Excellent. If there are any more questions, please. Oh, yeah. Pete, go for it.
I was listening to Alex there and Nick. One of the things that you're going to have to bear in mind, and coaches are really going to have to focus hard on, particularly where you've got groups of paddlers coming back or crew boats coming back into training. Some of the paddlers may have been able to paddle. Some may have been able to use paddling machines. Some may have been able to sustain their cardiovascular fitness and strength. But paddlers are going to come back in after this shutdown or lockdown. They're going to come back in at various different levels, very different from where they were before the lockdown. And the mental side of the paddlers is that, you know, you always remember, even I remember, and I still strive to get back to where I used to be when I was at my best. So one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the paddlers as they come back in, and they're going to be coming back into training again, and their perception of where they are and what they're doing is going to be incredibly difficult to deal with.
Brilliant. Thanks, Pete. I think that, Peter, that's a great point. I think obviously as a slalom coach, that's broadened my mind to think about where, when in crew boats, people may be coming back to paddling in very different levels of fitness, very different levels of emotional and physical readiness, and how the intensity of training must be planned to consider all individuals as a collective and not just one or two. I guess I've got all through this process, a lot of the advice I've been hearing from various trusted sources has been very similar to a return from injury protocol. And I think it's that sense of, Mark Proctor will enjoy this one. Stephen Gerrard once said, when advising around a return from injury, it's important, and this takes a lot of support from a team around an athlete, to focus on where you are and taking steps from each day forward, rather than looking back on where you think you should be or where you were previously. Easy to say, difficult to do, but I think as coaches we have a real responsibility to try and support a process, that, a psychologically safe process in that space that allows them to return to training in a positive way. Thank you very much, Peter. And thanks very much to everyone for their engagement. Sid's posting some useful links there on growth mindset on the British Canoeing website. and some other stuff around constraints, which I talked on very briefly and probably completely off topic to Alex there. It is a passion of mine, and that will be a topic down the line in terms of practice design. And there may well be an avenue to come together on that or branch off into specific disciplines. I'm just going to summarize some key takeaways. In fact, I'm going to come to the panel, actually, if I may. So, Alex, key advice, key take-home for the listeners today?
Oh, which way to go with this? I guess a message for now, like just keep connecting, keep doing what feels right for everybody. So if it's tuning into these CPD sessions, brilliant. Doing little creative things that seem to keep us engaged. I think there's a real period of learning here, as Neil said. So let's make the most of it.
Brilliant. James?
Yeah, I think maybe not take homes, but I maybe just an answer to Pete there around my suggestion, or what it brings me to think around is that question for clubs around how can we reframe sessions to avoid those comparisons in the short term, and really focus on their areas where they can grow. Would probably be the bit that just struck me is if we're all, and I think that's relevant for clubs, but it's really pulled out of me, like the same equivalent for the athletes I'm working with. How can I reframe some of those things so they link to the qualities I want to develop, but probably avoiding some of those comparisons they naturally would make. So I think that was a really interesting point, and something I maybe hadn't thought in much detail about yet. So that was really good. And I think the wider bit is just I think great goal setting and clear purpose, and then a focus on processes can really help through any of these situations, and just generally with athlete motivation.
I think that's gold. Thanks, James. That sense of how we frame training that will influence behaviour and experience of a return to training. Key. Final ones from Neil and Nick. Neil, to you first.
Yeah, I think understand where we are. Be very positive. Be safe, and enjoy the moment.
Lovely. Thank you, Neil. And Mr. Fowler, last but not least, before I wrap up myself.
How do I follow that? I think it's just like you say, acknowledging where athletes are currently in their state when they start to return, but keeping the individual focus, reinforcing the fact that whatever state they might have been in, they will get back to where they were, and with all due diligence, get past and on into the future. But it's making sure that you keep an eye out for maybe anything that has maybe simmered away under lockdown, and just making sure that sort of everything's out in the open with regards to, where that athlete currently sits, either psychologically, physiologically, wherever they are. So good communication, individual approach, and yeah, like Neil said, keep it fun.
Beautifully said. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Alex, Neil, and James, for all your contributions today. Going to wrap that up now. We are in the background compiling an excellent list. We've had some great suggestions for sessions and who might feature upon those. Please keep those coming into SID. In the background, we're working on some improvements, i.e. the sort of notice period of sessions in terms of content might be more appealing than others. We're going to take a slight pause, Sid and I, in the next couple of days, really to structure and theme the content in a little bit more strategic manner. And we're currently looking and discussing around the potential for a forum post-webinars where people can debate and kind of a reflective space that we can help coaches sort of absorb, make sense of the session. Because the big thing for me through this period is how will we as coaches action our learning? There's a lot of learning going on. We're swamped with it online. You probably can't keep up with the amount of webinars you can log into. Keep bringing it back to self. Keep it simple. How will you action it in terms of your learning? So thank you very much. Sid and I will be in touch about the next webinar. We're not in a position to commit to that just now, as we're going to kind of re-strategize a little bit. But as ever, this is available on YouTube and the digital library on British Canoeing. So thanks very much, and stay safe out there, guys. Take care.